Hello. There is plenty of debate these days about whether the core of the Warhammer hobby belongs to the story and the setting, the modelling and the painting, or the rules and the game itself. Or, of course, if it's a combination of all of those different aspects. But one thing that most people do seem to agree on is that Citadel miniatures are really damn cool. My guest today joined the Citadel sculpting team in the early 2000s and created an incredible range of miniatures for Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40,000, Necromunda, and many, many more. In time, he went on to sculpt miniatures for amazing companies like Privateer Press, before founding his own miniature company, Black Scorpion Miniatures, which is still going strong after 20 years. We talk about the process of sculpting a miniature, what it was like in the Citadel training program, and how you really go about carving tangible fantasy out of solid green stuff. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Adam Clarke. Adam, thank you so much for joining me to chat a bit about your career as a miniature sculptor. I guess the first place that I wanted to start with was where you started your journey with miniatures as a whole. Where was your sort of entry point into the hobby?
Yeah, thanks for having me, and good to be here. The earliest memory I've got is Space Crusade.
Hmm.
I was watching your video actually on the history of. I think we briefly had Hero Quest with my brothers, but I was so young I can't. And even Space Crusade, I was too young to really understand it as a. It was more just like a silly toy with.
Sure.
And I had the Dreadnought expansion with all the little extra, so I thought that was brilliant. That was the earliest, and I think briefly maybe some of those fighting fantasy books.
Right.
But really, it began. There was in Torquay, the Games Workshop, kind of going into there. But I just remember I used to look in the window, and I was too scared to go in. I don't know what age this was, 10 or something, and I was too scared to go in because this was back in the day when it was more of a community and it was full of people in there, and it was like a hub of. But at some point, I did and got one of the old. Do you remember the old promotional catalogs where they'd show like the adverts for 40k and
Sure, yeah.
fantasy? I think it was Epic back then, um, and immediately I was drawn to fantasy more than like this. So this would have been is it fourth edition with the the elves, the
Sure, and the
goblins,
goblins. Yeah,
and the cardboard.
yeah, that's right.
I think that's fourth. And I was trying to pick which I wanted. I was briefly looking at Epic just because of the amount of models. Glad I didn't. It's like that would have been no interest. But I was never particularly interested in 40k. It didn't really appeal to me. But so I think I probably got that for Christmas or birthday or something. And apart from that, I didn't really. I had no money to buy any of the. So if the only models I got were kind of birthday gifts or something, but I was obsessed with Warhammer from then on. I just loved it, especially that edition. I used to play it with people at school and my friends and stuff. So that was really how I got into it. And quickly, I think over the years, I quickly started switching more to miniature painting. Became more interested in the painting side of it than the gaming, and Do you remember the old games days? The 95 was my first games day, so that was like a big.
Right.
I think I entered the young bloods. Golden
Yeah.
didn't get anywhere, but I was like, yeah, so inspired by all the other entries and so I think the studio were there, and so I was kind of hooked from then on, and really obsessed with painting and Golden Demon. So that's where my kind of interest really focused to, and it was always more kind of display painting, like painting one model as best I could, as opposed to army painting.
Right.
And so yeah, it was. And so White Dwarf back in the day was quite a big thing because this was pre-internet. So, excuse me. In terms of paint, like White Dwarf was like a really important magazine for anything to do with like Mike McVeigh's dioramas. That was like the main. So many people say this, but that was like huge.
Yeah.
Anything like that when you buy it, or a fantasy battle report. And later on, if they had like little sculpting articles, that was the only source of information. So if they showed a picture of a green, that was like where the only place to learn from. So, so yeah, that was pretty much how I got into it. It was just going to the local games workshop and fantasy. I got into Blood Bowl as well, and Necromunda, but it was always fantasy. Was my main thing. I played Orcs and Goblins, so I was just obsessed with the. So this was the old Kev Adams, is it? Kev
Right.
Adams Goblins, like the old Night
Sure, yeah.
Goblins. And later, Brian Nelson did all that, the more caricature ones. I loved those, all the Squig Hoppers, the Stone Trolls. A lot of those models are still classics today. The
Yeah.
Water Giant.
Yeah.
I still like bringing that back out. Actually,
They are. Yeah. I mean, it stood the
I've
test of
still got
time, I
one I
think.
haven't glued together. That's a project I'm going to be working on, is redoing my old Orc and Goblin army. Like now, I've got all the old metals,
Yeah.
and so I'm going to redo it and paint it one day. Like
That's
properly.
very cool.
Yeah,
So do you still have any of the originals that you painted back in the day to compare
from.
to? Or is it from
Oh,
memory?
no, I do have some of the. I've still got some of the models that I did nicely, like entries and stuff like that, but not my old armies. They're all gone now.
Right.
The metals I got were from later when I worked in the store briefly as like part time when I was at college. And this was back in the day when they had what was called lead weight staff discount. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Sure, right.
When you could
Yeah.
order, I can't remember what the price per kilo was. It was something like 2, 3, something ridiculous, like a couple of pound a kilo. And they
Right.
take out your wages literally per kilo and just take £2 out of your wages. So we would order our armies. It's just, looking back now, you just think, why didn't you get more? But it's like,
But then
yeah,
that
so
sounds very dangerous.
no,
That
it's
there's
crazy.
yeah.
So I bought on lead weight all the old Night Goblin metals and Stone Trolls and all that, but I still never touched them. So I want to paint all the
Oh wow,
yeah.
yeah.
And obviously as metal faded out, they got rid of that, and I think they probably had a problem with staff running their own little side businesses. I would imagine, because they
Sure.
yeah. But those were the glory days. That was with the very little plastic back then, so
Hmm. Yeah.
and the plastic wasn't great, so it was all
So did
metal.
you got a job in a GW store then? That was the sort of
Yeah, so
next
my
step.
local store was Torquay, and I don't remember what age I was, probably 18. So I think you had to be 18 to get a job at the time.
Hmm.
And I was at college, and because you just hang out all the time, it was you just I think they were called key timers at the time.
Right.
And so I just worked. There weren't many hours, but it was just you worked there. And so that was just a job I had as I was for a couple of years at the retail store.
Yeah.
I think I think the pay at the time was like £3 an hour or something
Right.
like that, which was just hilarious. It's like,
Yeah. Less all of that money spent on lead.
yeah, so well, it pretty much was, because you just ordered, you would come in with the store orders, your lead weight. Yeah, Torquay is actually, unfortunately, it's actually closing now, the store in
Oh,
Torquay. It was, I know it was the worst performing store in the world.
right.
So it's a pity, but yeah, it was just yeah, one of those towns where not much was.
Hmm.
We used to get the foreign students come in the summer,
Right.
like language students from like Spain, France, Sweden, Italy, and so they would often come into Torquay and be introduced into the hobby and then go back overseas. But so I
Right.
don't think they took that into account when they collect. I don't think the head office really understood. Like actually, a lot of people have,
Hmm.
even though the store doesn't make any money, it's. But yeah, anyway, that was many years later. It closed, but
Right. So
so
where did you start getting into like sculpting then? So how did that
yeah.
emerge?
So what happened was it was kind of an extension from miniature painting, because I
Hmm.
was really into Golden Demon. That became my main focus, was painting Golden Demon. It became a lot of people were converting their models, and you kind of got the feeling like, oh, you have to convert and do something.
Hmm.
And I probably went too far with that and started forgetting about the painting. I was focused on sculpting, so I started basically doing it. For that, I started doing conversions and things like that. I remember actually green stuff was like impossible to get hold of
Sure, yeah.
for
Yeah.
a long time, and it was only because they started actually stocking it in the stores at some point that you could get a hold of a little bit.
Right.
because there was no, like I say, no internet, so it wasn't like you just ordered it online. If you didn't know where to get it, it was near impossible. So when they started selling it in the stores, that was like a major, because people used milliput and stuff, but it wasn't nice to sculpt with at that scale anyway. But
Right. So was that
yeah,
your like the material that you sort of really started to get to grips with?
yeah,
Green
because that's
stuff.
what they were using at head office, was
Right.
green stuff. And so occasionally you'd see in White Dwarf and they'd show like a green.
Yeah.
You'd go, oh, what's this magical green stuff? So, and so more and more, I just went from little conversions to actually sculpting my own various things or
Hmm.
busts and whatever. It was all terrible looking things, but yeah. And so apologies if I keep wiping my nose or sniffing. I'm
Well,
unwell.
I've forced you to come and do an
Yeah.
interview whilst you're not 100%. So apologies from me for that.
So I
But
briefly, I was at college while I was in retail, and actually my dream was to work for head office. But I want to be an heavy metal painter. That was like
right.
my and I was like inspired by Mike McVeigh's diorama, like everybody else was at the time. And so that was my. And I remember telling I was at art college, but one of these useless, like gluing pasta to complete waste of time.
Sure.
And I remember telling, I remember telling my the art teacher, who did not like me at all. He's like, "Oh, what do you want to do?" And I said, "Oh, I want to work for Games Workshop as a painter." And I remember he said to me, "Oh, it's like wanting to play for Man United. It's never going to happen."
Hmm.
Well, that's inspiring. Thank you. It's like, well, that's yeah. And so when I left college and I stopped working in the retail, I was doing some freelance work for like some of the smaller companies, but it was more like they would do like dolly kit stuff. So they'd send you precast bits, like
Right.
often like World War II or historical. It would have the main guy, like a weapon, pouches, and maybe a hat, and you'd put it together, kind of green stuff. And the only real sculpting you do is kind of like the arms. So basically,
Okay.
you're just posing pre-existing, and you'd sculpt the hands and the arm badly. And so I did that for about a year for various companies. Um, and the main thing I learned from that was that a lot of companies in the industry, certainly back then, there was a lot of blaggers and just people not paying, bouncing checks,
Right.
just a lot of, which was an important lesson for later on. So, oh, there's a lot. Maybe this happens in life in general, but this is my experience. There's a lot of charlatan in this
Hmm.
industry and you
Right.
see, unfortunately, you see it today with Kickstarters. This is still prevalent with certain companies, just
Hmm.
whether they start out with that intention or not. Just what there was one. So I won't name any of the bad ones. But one of the really good ones actually that's still going was Westwind
Right.
Productions. Really nice to work for, paid on time. So there was the good ones always stood out, and you could see they're still going today. So
Yeah.
yeah, and so from I did that for about a year, and then I think there was an advert in White Dwarf for a trainee miniature sculptor.
Oh,
Um, I can't remember if they specifically told you what to send in, but I sent in 3 greens I made specifically for like the application. And I remember said in the interview, like it said like you need to be good at sculpting, and then it said straight line design. I remember thinking I have no idea what straight like. I was so worried. I don't know what that means. Well, what's straight line design? And I was like, oh, they're going to ask me what that is, and I don't know. Which just means weapons and hard edge. I think they call it hard surface now, but
right.
I hadn't thought, oh, what does that mean? And so I sculpted 3. Can't remember what I did now. I've got them somewhere. So I sculpted 3 models that I sent in. Actually, it's worth mentioning before that I had occasionally sculpted something and sent it into head office just as like I want to be a sculptor with like a letter.
Yeah.
And I copied like a Space Marine or something. And Gary Morley wrote back to me and was like, "Oh, that's good. Keep going." um, but this was like an official, that we're looking for trainees. So I was quite excited about that. And I remember I made a box for I took an old crayon pencil box, converted it into a display case for my sculptures, sanded it all down and like put an Imperial Eagle on it, and so I had like a really nice, which worked, did the trick, because I later found out everyone else just sent in a bit of bubble wrap, and so apparently when the applicants were on the table, it was like my Imperial Eagle box that I made. It's like because I was aware like that I wasn't good enough, but I thought that's not it's a trainee position. No one's good enough. It's you got to show the potential and that you're. Yeah, so I got an interview, and Gary went up to Nottingham. Gary Morley interviewed me. With Owen Branham at the time. And it just went really well, the interview. And he said, "Oh, that's a good interview." I think they can tell when you're genuinely, you're passionate about the hobby. And he did tell me later that so many of the applicants were basically university graduates with design degrees who didn't really know what Games Workshop did. It was like, oh, it's a design job, and I'm
right.
Of course, what Games Workshop, they don't. You've got to be all in. They don't care about the. And so yeah, I got the job. Found out later I got the job. I can believe it's my dream. Well, I dreamed into it, be a painter. So to become a sculptor was unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that was So I had to move to Nottingham from Torquay. So that was a bit of a culture shock, but yeah.
I mean, what was the sort of culture like in the studio then? So when you were first starting, what was the sort of vibe of the place?
Yeah, it was unbelievable. It really was like a dream. A dream. I ought to mention before I actually been there once, because I did actually manage to win a Golden Demon.
Great, yeah.
And so the prize back in the day used to be a trip to head office. And then at the end, you get to go around mail order with a box and fill it with as much as you can. That was what the prize used to be. So that was unbelievable. And we went around the studio, and I think I hadn't started, but I think I'd got the job. I knew I'd got the job. So we went in that studio, and I think Gary spotted me. He was like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, just So I got a kind of the vibe of like, obviously at my interview, I'd been there briefly as well, but it was absolutely amazing. It was like everything you could have done. Because you probably remember back in the 90s, they really promoted in White Dwarf like the sculptors, and they credited everyone. They do articles on individual sculptors. So these were all my heroes I knew pretty much all of them, who they were. It was unbelievable. It was such a good atmosphere though. The sculptors, we used to have our own little we used to be upstairs. We had our own offices. It depends, it'd be 2 or 3. And we had the end office, which was the biggest, where some of the trainees were, and Gary Morley and a few other people. There were more of us in that office. The other thing that was going on at the time was Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Ours was what was called a Lord of the Rings office. So we had another big sign. So strict, because they're really strict about, they're worried about leaks for Lord of the Rings. So if that was on the door, it meant pretty much no one else could come in unless you worked in that office. So our office was kind of quite restricted, but it was just amazing, an amazing time, amazing atmosphere there. It was like a dream come true, really. So the other trainee at the time was Martin Footer, who still works there.
Right.
And I didn't know when I arrived, like how many other trainees or who. So met him. Still a good friend of mine. Yeah, it was just an amazing time. It was
That's great.
Very good atmosphere there, and to see everyone. It was there was no all the other sculptors were so friendly and willing to help. No one, there was never a vibe of like, oh, who's this new person wasting my time? They were so willing to help. Like Jez Goodwin, everybody was like genuinely eager to teach and help you to. And he was very very relaxed. You could just go around to the other offices and ask them, anything you wanted to know. And so Gary Morley was like the direct boss / trainee teacher. He was our kind of, but you could really go and ask anybody anything you wanted to know. So when I first started, there was excuse me, a couple of main things that were happening. One of them was they were really concerned about. I don't know if they were concerned about it, but all the talk of people were moaning was scale creep at the time. I don't know if you remember this kind of fad of people moaning about how the models kept getting bigger. Of course, now it's kind of all they just jumped the size 18 years,
Yeah.
sensibly so. Um, and so because this was a thing, what we actually on my first day, they told me and Martin, the first thing we're going to do is we had to measure every single model ever made, or not ever made, but every single model in mail order, and not just every model, but every component, every proportion
Right.
of every single model ever made, and make a note. And it took us a month for two of us full time to measure
Right.
every single model.
Wow. I
Yeah.
mean, and when
So we
that
went down to mail
wasn't,
order, got a bucket of each. We organised it between us, and then we were
yeah,
like, what was the ruler? The logic was it was to work out like an average size of each
right,
rate, which we could see was a waste of time from the start. But it was, and all they did with it at the end was make like a silhouette chart
right.
to say like an Imperial Guard is X high, and everyone just ignored it. And I was like,
Sounds like they maybe were hazing you in your first month.
I don't think so because maybe because the thing was Martin had been an heavy metal painter for like 7 years.
Hmm.
So it was very different for him because he'd already been in the production studio. He knew everyone. He was way ahead of me because obviously he'd been able to talk to sculptors and get advice. And
Hmm.
so it was probably worse for him because it's like this was just still, he was still going to work the same every day. He was probably losing his mind. But for me, I was just excited to be there. It's, it's like, so I didn't mind too much. But by the end, we were definitely ready to get started on stuff. It was, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what was that sort of process like then? So for trainees, because you often hear about trainee models and some of this stuff that sort of doesn't get released or it sort of was only done to help someone learn. Is that like what were the sort of briefs like in the process of becoming a fully fledged Citadel sculptor?
Yeah. So to start with, after we finished that month of measuring things, Gary would basically just set us little projects to do. Um, and the environment was very relaxed. It was very much just to help you learn and get better. There was no they really relieved the pressure as much as they because the trainee projects were literally just for you to learn. There was not like this is going to be released
Mm,
or and it was once the thing is you've got the job. It's not like a trainee program where there's 30 and we're going to pick two.
mm,
There's no prep. You've got the job. It's just you need to just get better kind of thing. And so what he'd do to start with, he'd say do things like copy a las gun. You've got a week. Co-
right.
Copy it perfectly, and obviously give you tips and tricks as to how they make a. In reality, those las guns and things were actually plastics that were
Right.
made 3M, but for practice purposes, we were making a 1-to-1 um, just to learn straight line design. And then the next week it was make a bolter.
Mm,
We'd go through like that'd be like straight line design prep. And Martin, by the way, was like he became like one of the straight line. He made a lot of the iconic tanks, and he was just so good at straight line design. It was just infuriating how. I mean, I got way better. I got pretty good, but I mean, just that guy was under. The accuracy is like his actually is like you would think it was done by computer now. That's how good
mm,
he was. And then so there'd be projects like that, and then they'd say to sort of make a wizard. You got a week, 2 weeks to make a, and so that's pretty. And he obviously give you feedback along the way, and
mm.
it was very relaxed, so you could go and chat to people, ask for advice, and so that was it. It was just, I mean, I put pressure on myself because I was aware, I was a true trainee in the sense I wasn't anywhere near the level of, and so what would happen is me and Martin were there. I don't think anyone knows this that worked there, but we didn't go home. Like, I mean, quite literally, we were there till 8, 9, 10, 11 p.m. and we'd come in on Saturdays and Sundays most time. Often the security had to kick us out because like 11 p.m. the badge stopped working.
Right.
And so security would come around regularly, like, "What time are you staying till tonight?" And it's like you're gonna have to go because you're gonna be stuck here otherwise. But that's how much we loved it there. It wasn't like a trying to show off because no one even knew we were.
Mm,
It was just like obsessive about getting once you're into something, trying to get better. And when you're in that environment, it's just so inspiring. You want to keep doing it. And of course, they had all my at the time. Mike McVeigh's dioramas were in the studio in the corridors, so every day I'd just stare at them. Just yeah.
So with some of those trainee projects, would they ever end up being released, or were they literally you do it and then it goes? You get to take it home basically.
Yeah, they normally mold them for us just so we could see the process,
Right.
And see if there's any issues with molding because we had to learn about that as well. So we'd get copies of them, and occasionally you see leaks because obviously it goes through the process of going through the molding, and people can get their hands on them. So occasionally those things do leak out into the public, but no, they're not. There might be occasions where if a sculptor's new but it's not strictly a trainee, they might give them kind of a warm up practice project, and that might or might not be released. Kind of it's a no pressure type thing, but they might. But no, the trainee models were strictly trained, and they were never good enough anyway to.
Right.
Look. I know people look at them with kind of nostalgia, but generally they're just not up to the standard of the. Yeah.
Right. And then you presumably there's some sort of not necessarily a graduation, but like a point at which you stop being a trainee and you are a sculptor just at that level, right?
I think there's a certain point. There's two sides to it. There's one that's the actual models. What they tend to do, actually, with fairly early on, is they start giving you projects that are for release.
Right.
They kind of ease you in. You might just do one model that's part of a pack. I think we did like a Black Library. What was it called? Lone Wolves. We did like the Lone Wolves diorama, me and Martin. So they do stuff like that to kind of ease you in, like, hey, this is going to be released. And then eventually you're just doing normal releases.
Right.
And at some point, separately to that, which is almost like a pay scale type thing, they change your title from you're not a trainee anymore. But in terms of actually doing proper models, it happened fairly quickly, actually.
Right.
And obviously they pick what they're going to give you, and they don't suddenly start you off with a hugely complex project. And sometimes you might work on plastics. So the other thing that was one of the things we'd often do, there was a thing called, we referred to as one-to-ones back in the day. Have you ever heard of this?
Just is like a management thing.
I don't know if people know about this, but we would call them one-to-ones, which was
Right.
So when there was a plastic project, plastics are weird because the amount of I think some of your other people were talking about this that you interviewed about how long it takes to do a plastic
Sure,
project,
yeah.
about how far in advance you have to work just because of the time it takes to do it in 3-up. This is
Right.
all different now. This is back when we did it by hand. The time it takes to do it in 3-up, and then the tooling and just the whole process is very, very, very slow. But what the people who are organizing would consistently forget is that White Dwarf was a factor that they worked another 3 months ahead.
Right.
And for them, so if that plastic set was released, that would have to be painted and in White Dwarf on the release date, which meant they were working 3 or 4 months ahead.
Right.
And so the heavy metal team needed those models to paint on X day before.
Right.
And
Okay.
the design studio were only thinking about, oh, we got to get tooled by there and it's got to be released. And they weren't thinking, well, this other studio actually needs copies of these plastics.
Right.
And so consistently they would just someone would suddenly realize, like, where's the plastics to paint? And they were like, oh, we're not going to have them from another month. And pure panic would set in. And so the answer they came up with was we called it one-to-ones, where
Right.
they get sculptors to resculpt the entire plastic set in actual scale to mold just for the painters to,
Oh wow.
which suffice to say, annoyed annoyed people. No, not to mention the time and the work that would go into it. Um, so a lot of the box sets you used to see back then with the plastics weren't the plastics in they were metal
Right.
one-to-ones, we call it, and you can probably spot errors. I did the Rhino Chaos Rhino kit that went on
Right.
the normal Rhino. I did the one-to-ones for that.
Right.
I didn't mind because it was all good practice at the time, but everyone else hated it because it was just infuriating. Yeah, and there was one. Here's a challenge for your for people to find. There was a I I remember it being a Lizard Man plastic set, but I might be wrong. There was one box set where it was one-to-ones and on the photo, the model had actually broken, and the picture had made the final box set with an arm hanging on the ground, and you can see that it's metal.
Right.
So I don't know if anyone can find that because I saw the box set up in the studio because we had like a fake shop up there, and I was looking, I was like, that's broken. How is that made the? And I remember being Lizardman, but I could be wrong about that. See if anyone can find the old. That would be about 2002.
Right. Well, yeah, that is a
A
challenge.
little challenge. So that was
That's
something else we
wild.
do. Oh, and
Yeah.
obviously now with digital, they can just 3D print the.
Mm.
If that ever happens, it's a yeah. So that was going on.
Yeah.
And
Would you go on? Sorry.
the other thing that was happening at the time was they were really concerned about shrinkage. They had a lot of issues with shrinkage on the metals
Right.
because of the sheer volume they were selling. Was they had to have normally when you used to make metals, you'd have a master mold, and then you take masters and make a production mold. They were selling so many models and getting through molds, they had to have an extra thing called a gold mold, like an extra stage, because even the master molds were wearing out of how many.
Wow.
Because I think at the time they had 10 full-time production mold makers making 8 molds a day. So they were making 80 new production molds every day
Wow.
to keep up with metal demand. And because of that extra gold mold stage, the shrinkage in the metal was becoming a real problem. Like you probably wouldn't notice it if you just looked at the production models, but when we compare like the green to especially something like a space marine, the difference was almost like sometimes up to 50%, like squashing.
Wow. Okay.
And so what they introduced, what right about when I started, was resin master molding.
Mm.
And so the masters were then done in resin, which has like almost zero shrinkage, as like an extra. And they got some more advanced, like these pink rubber. And so it was a real jump in production quality. So this is a very different to not to be confused with fine cast
Right.
resin. This is master, which is the same process I use for my company now. This hand cast resin. It's a different. So
Sure.
it just gives you just the highest quality of reproduction that you can get. That's yeah. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But
No, that's interesting though. So would they still be using that for metals as well at
yeah,
that time? Then? Yeah.
that was just for metals.
Right. Okay.
Because plastics were done in 3-up.
Right.
It was a whole different process. We made them 3 times the size, and they were tooled with a what do you call it? A pentagraph, whatever the machine is
Right.
called.
Okay. And that's to put them
So
on
that,
the sprues and all that sort of stuff
yeah,
as well, right?
that was just for metals. Because back in the time it was still mostly metal
Mm.
with a little bit of plastic. And so that did mean that because before we only used green stuff because of the production process. Green stuff was one of the few things that could stand up to the heat and the pressure.
Right.
With resin master mold, it meant we could then use pretty much anything. Like if you want to use Fimo or polymer clay, not
Okay.
many people did. I think Juan Diaz played with it a little bit,
Right.
but it just meant the options were open to do if you wanted to sculpt with something different.
Right.
Yeah,
Was that
Juan,
open to the actual sculptor themselves then? They
yeah,
could just go, I'd prefer to work in this medium
yeah,
now.
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We generally worked in green stuff or brown stuff, which is very similar to green stuff, but it's a slightly different feel to it.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, and there's a Swedish guy called Alex Hedström, who's a very good sculptor. He played with different putties and things.
Right.
Yeah, but it was nice just to have the option of. And Juan was a friend of mine who really taught me a lot. Gary kind of taught me, like when I started, he taught me the basics because I didn't have a clue about. He taught me like this is how we build an armature, this is how we make like all the core. But Juan really got into like teaching me stuff about like what really makes a good model. He was way ahead of his time at the. Do you
Yeah.
remember Juan's model? Some of Juan's models?
Well, the Demonettes, for
Yeah,
instance, right?
yeah,
They were a big one.
yeah. He made so many that were,
Yeah.
and he was talking about stuff that was about how models he thinks thought they should be made, and I thought was way ahead of his time.
Hmm.
Stuff they've done now, like the size of the model and proportions, and he set up a lot of the things that I kind of took on later years that really taught me how to. Yeah, he's made some of my favorite models, I think.
Yeah. Because was there like a style guide where you always had to conform in some way to these particulars of a given range or an army
Kind
or
of. I think most people at work, they kind of had that style anyway.
right,
Um, but everyone had their own style. Like back when it was metal, I could look at a model and tell you who sculpted it
right,
straight away. No, obviously now because it's all plastic and intermixed, it's kind of got a generic. Um, but no, there were just certainly individual styles. Occasionally, they'd say certain things like the common one would be like, "Oh, that weapon needs to be a bit bigger," or more skulls, or something like that. There were individual styles. I think everyone just fit in anyway. You'd get concept art. Um,
right.
but yeah, most people's style fit in anyway. I think it was.
Yeah. Do you have any favorites from from like that you worked on during that time?
I was really always into the anything fantasy, like the you were mentioning the Tutujin. How do you pronounce that? Tutujin guy?
Yeah, Tutagen, I
No one
think.
ever told me.
Think.
It's like, yeah, I like those ones.
The Middenheimers, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Any of those? The Bretonian. Is it the questing knight? The guy with the big standard bearer. I liked him.
Right.
Some of the nobles I did. Yeah, I liked those ones. Yeah, I always like fantasy was my main thing. I was always into. So I was a bit. It was later on where they kind of ditched the old world for. So that was a bit of a shame. But
Mm, yeah.
yeah, what did you think when they got? I don't know what year it was now, but when they kind of got rid of the old.
So I think it was 2015 was the end
Yeah,
of
yeah,
Warhammer and the start of Age of Sigmar. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, it was a big change, I think. And it was definitely hard to swallow in a lot of ways.
yeah. Because when I was there, we knew that fantasy wasn't as popular as we knew that 40K was the big seller,
Right.
but I don't think they ever really communicated that it was doing that badly, like in terms of sales. But I'd already kind of when I started there, it's kind of become a bit disillusioned with fantasy the way it was, the way they were doing it. Like
Mm,
not from a design, I loved the sculpting, but from a customer game point of view, I'd already
mm.
felt it had gone in the wrong direction and was confused by. It felt like a restaurant with a menu with so many items,
Sure.
like too many items on it, and then someone's going, "Oh, well, every time we add a new item, that sells a little bit better than, so we'll keep doing that,"
Mm,
rather than stopping and going, let's sort this out," kind of thing. I feel like the answer was to maybe get rid of it, but bring it back and call it like the end times or something,
mm.
and then reduce down the armies to the core army books,
Mm.
and then within those army books break it down to the core units, and then you have like a legend section with the old stuff for people who've got old, so they can still use it.
Mm.
And then you have to have the tooling, packaging. Every element has to work at the start from the design point of view, so that it works together, as opposed to rules, models. Now you package it
Sure.
so that you maximize the tooling, so that for example, instead of just selling a plastic rock lobber, you have a detachment, which is a rock lobber, two doom divers in one box.
Right.
And sometimes you can sprue those together on the
Mm.
sprue. So you're saving space, time, money. And obviously you'd have to sell it at an appropriate price, which they might struggle with. But, and then, for Empire, you'd have three cannons. It would be a cannon detachment.
Right.
And so you'd then release an army box with your core army, and the rules would work with this, so that when you're in the rules, you take a rock
Mm.
lobber, two doom divers. So you have your core army, of which some of when the rules will be, you can only have one of that. And then the add-on boxes are just like detachments. So you might for saving space and money, you might have stone trolls and put 3 squig hoppers on the same rather than. So your night goblins will be 20 night goblins with the command with the fanatics in
Right.
one.
Yeah.
So you can tool and price it together, and then the rules work with that. You have to take your 25. So you just simplify everything down. I think that could have worked, and then so instead of having millions of things, you have detachments and just key boxes.
Yeah.
And then in the rules, you just say like, yeah, the world's kind of everything's gone, but there are little forces left that you can. So you have to find these detachments.
Yeah.
You can't just select individual bits. You have to find a guy, and he's got maybe 10 crossbowmen and a Hellblaster volley gun, and it comes in a box together.
It certainly seems like there was dramatic changes needed in those later stages, weren't there? And
I understand for a purist that wouldn't be the ideal, but I'm thinking from Games Workshop point of view, you've got to have a way that works.
Yeah.
To because I think just dressing them up as Space Marines wasn't the best.
Well, it's very different flavor,
yeah, it's
isn't
not
it?
really. Yeah, it doesn't appeal to the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, are you excited to see the old world has returned? Have you sort of taken a look at that?
Yeah, but it looks like I looked at the new Bretonian Footlights. The new ones are really nice. So that shows what they can do. But then releasing kind of the old box sets, but even though I made some of those, it's kind of, it just doesn't seem like they've really putting a full effort into it, as opposed to. I was watching your interview. Is it Mark Wells? Have I got his name right?
The CEO.
Yeah.
CEO. Yeah.
He was making an interesting point about how doing things to defend that sometimes you need, as a company, you need to defend your position. I think he's talking about Lord of the Rings, maybe. Because this is the thing. It's not it's not impossible that another big company might decide to have a crack at fantasy in hard plastic, and could have been working on it for years, and will suddenly release. If they suddenly release massive plastic box sets and armies, the Games Workshop are going to suddenly have a bit of a wake up, and that could be happening. People don't know what might be going on in the background, but yeah, it's nice. I'm pleased to see they're releasing things like the Old Giant, and I know that's slightly different. That's the made to order, isn't it? But yeah, there's a little bit of nostalgia there. But it'd be nice to see them focus on it all new, and really, think of it from scratch again.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I know there's a lot of different viewpoints on the releasing of historic miniature sets, the older stuff. I quite like them, but that's part of the nostalgia for me. And one of the reasons I quite like it is because it's a chance to get those miniatures that were around when I wanted them 20 years ago that I couldn't afford or didn't have access to for whatever reason. So yeah, it definitely ticks a lot of my boxes in that regard.
I see it from their point of view, like, hey, the tooling's already done, it's already made. There's a lot of money, time, and effort goes into making, especially a new plastic set. So I get it. And then you can just, I don't know, what have they released so far? I'm not sure. Is it just the Bretonians?
Bretonians, Tomb Kings, Orcs and Goblins have been released at this point. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
See what happens.
But yeah, so I mean, back in terms of your career with GW, it wasn't too long before you decided to move on and sort of moved into a sort of freelance space, right? And you started working with a lot of other companies as well. Could you talk about that sort of transition and what it was like?
Yeah, so after 2 years or so, I realized like I probably want to start my own company and do my own thing. I want to travel a lot and be my own boss, do what I want, make what I want to make. And so I left. I moved to Spain from Nottingham, and basically my main aim was to start working on my own miniature range. But obviously, I knew that wasn't going to happen overnight. So kind of when I could, I was making my own stuff. And doing freelance work just to get by. And so I worked for a few companies. Like I did Privateer Press, Reaper. Probably forget half of them. But Privateer Press were one of the really good companies to work for. So when I contacted them, Mike McVeigh was working there. So I'd never met him before. So that
Right.
was a thrill to get an email from, as I worked for Mike McVeigh for freelance for a bit. Um, yeah, and it was very different because like them and other companies at Rackham, I didn't do anything for, but they would work very, very different. Where the concept, it wasn't artistic; it was a concept specifically designed for a sculptor to make the model. It was very
All right.
like a flat pose, kind of like that, just putting on what goes where very clearly. Very good artwork, but it was very precise. Like, that's what you make. Don't get adventurous. So it's different. Whereas Games Workshop was a lot of freedom to design your at the time, anyway.
Right.
But they were very good concepts, so they were nice to make. With some of the Iron Kingdoms, something like I think the Iron Kingdoms was what it called at the time. A lot of the characters for that, and
Right.
Scorn and other things. Um, I'm not sure what's happened with Privateer Press lately. I know they're still going, but I hear they're not maybe as big as they once were. But I've not really kept up with it. But
Mm.
they were really nice to work for. Paid very well. No messing around. And anyone who's ever worked with Mike McVeigh will only have good things. Like, it's one of those people you'll never hear a bad word about him. It's really got everyone's got good things to say about him. So
Did you get
that
to
was
ask him
nice.
about his dioramas or talk about those at all?
Only recently, because that then it was obviously just work, and I was didn't want to come across as a fan a fanboy. But I saw him over the years. I've seen him a few times. I saw him at Warhammer Fest actually last year. Did you go to that? Or
The one in Manchester. Yeah, I did.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, so I got to show my entry there at Warhammer Fest and talk to him a bit about stuff. So yeah, I've seen a few interviews with him, so that's always good to see him.
Yeah.
He's such a humble guy as well. I genuinely don't think he understands the impact he had on the. Yeah, I read his uh in the Talking Miniatures book because you had
Mm.
those guys on, didn't you?
Yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
Robin and John.
so he's got a really good bit in that as well.
Mm.
In that bit, I'd recommend that book to anyone that wants to.
Mm. It's fantastic.
And
Yeah.
Dice Men as well is another good one.
Mm.
The Ian Livingstone one. Yeah. Yeah, so that was the freelance thing. Basically, what I was doing was that to and on the side, I was making models for Black Scorpion, what would become Black Scorpion,
Mm.
just little character models, um, and the basis of it was based off conversations that I had with Juan about kind of sizing and talking about proportions.
Mm.
And so I made my models were 32 mil, which people like would kind of moan about, but it was based on now. Of course, it just seems normal, but this is 20 years ago. People were like, but Juan was kind of thinking ahead of the time. Would go into detail about his thoughts about why models should be at least that size, etc., etc. So now it just seems like 32 millimeter resin just seems like such a normal thing, but at the time it was yeah, a little bit controversial, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, what was the vision then for Black Scorpion? What did you want to achieve with the company?
So my main apart from just obviously I want to work for myself was I just wanted it was really just to keep improving as a sculptor, and it's still the same to this day. Everything I do is in some way is a something I set myself like a challenge or something I'm trying to learn. Every
Mm.
model is quite specific that it's and then it will fit in somehow, but it's nearly always a sculpting exercise. It might be something incredibly subtle, but it's always in some way just to improve. And the other than that, the aim was I wanted to. This is a bit hard to explain, but there was a weird disconnect I felt between historical companies and like fantasy companies. And
Mm.
people often like I don't know if you've ever heard of referred to as like the fantasy tax, like the fantasy models cost more. They call it the
Right.
fantasy tax simply because it's fantasy. But I noticed a weird disconnect between the standard as well between historic sci-fi fantasy and the historical world. It's a bit of a generalization, but there was a quality difference, and it kind of appealed to me to make kind of historical, not strictly historical, but in that theme
Mm.
from the fantasy. Like what would happen if Games Workshop made cowboys? What would they look like? So it was that rather than if you look at purely historical ones, often very bit flat and not often that interesting. So I kind of wanted to merge the two with pricing that was more in line with what the historical market was used to. So that it's like, oh, these are the same price, but look at the quality of, which seemed to work quite well. So
Yeah.
yeah, that was the basic idea of it.
Has it been quite like obviously that's 20 years that you've been running
Yeah.
Black Scorpion then. So has it been a smooth sailing sort of period? Have there been sort of big challenges, or what kind of things have been the most difficult, I suppose, elements of setting up your own company?
Yeah, it was. I suppose I had youthful naivety at the at the start. You don't think because at the start I was quite I was quite realistic about that. It's not gonna You're not just gonna set up a company that's successful overnight. So I had quite a realistic aim of make some models. Once I got the website up and running, which is like 2005, I was under no illusion I'm suddenly going to be full time. I thought if I can just sell enough to make the next molds, to pay for the next molds and casting, and just keep building a range.
Hmm.
And there was no real, I didn't go into debt or anything to set it up, so because I made all the models myself. So it wasn't a huge amount of risk in that sense. But it turned out that it was quite quick. It was about 6 months. The real turning point was the first salute I traded at was 2006.
Right.
And I just made the first two cowboy packs, Tombstone 1 and 2. So all I had was like 10 random little fantasy models. I think I had a little range of like US Marine moderns and these two cowboy packs. That's the but it was just like sold out so quickly, like I couldn't
Yeah.
keep up with. And so that was the turning point where I was like, okay, I could do this full time now.
Hmm.
And yeah, over the years, there's obviously been some ups and downs. One of the big ones was switching to resin, which was something I want to do anyway. But my hand was forced in a couple of ways. One, the cost of metal was getting so
Hmm.
crazy; it was just untenable. The weight and postage costs were going up, so the weight was just completely out of control. And demand, because it was a third-party company doing they just couldn't keep up with um, the stock I needed. And so I switched to do it in-house, doing resin, basically the same process that we used to do at Games Workshop with the master,
Right.
which is only possible for a smaller Games Workshop can never do, or a bigger company could never do that because the molds, it was very labor intensive,
Right.
and the molds don't last as long, and it's just, but a small kind of one-man band can get away with it, and obviously the quality is then, the highest it can be.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that was a bit of a challenge. We got through that. And you still get people who are, want their metals back, but
Sure.
which I kind of get. But yeah, that's just the yeah. So yeah, and over the years, there's been ups and downs. You see different. Obviously, Brexit being a big one the last few
Hmm.
years, but yeah, we get by somehow. And other than that, it's been pretty. I think what happened was I had to make it. We did a Kickstarter for Tombstone. Um, I made like 100 new models, did a rule book, and ran it on Kickstarter. It was huge for a small company. And after that, things were getting really just. I was also supplying just trade sales and things were getting more than I could handle. Basically, yeah, I even had a staff member at that point, and so I had to kind of make a decision about like, well, either I go up to the next level, which is more staff, premises with casters, and
Hmm.
I had to make a decision: do you want to do that or reduce things down? It really came down to: do you want to be a manager of a company or be a miniature sculptor? And I thought, no, I want to be a sculptor. It's like, also because I know in this industry, the bigger you get, the more easy it is to fail because I've seen it so many times. It's in niche industries, especially, it's very easy to get ahead of yourself, and it only takes a couple of bad months, and before you know it, you're in.
Hmm.
And so I made active steps to reduce down. I stopped trade sales and had to actively kind of reduce down the selling, and which was the best decision I made because it was just actually get back to sculpting again. At the time, I was just doing everything but. I like particularly. So yeah, that was a big decision. But yeah, just focusing on the sculpting, which I still do now. So just trying to get better still. I still have the same attitude I had when I started as a trainee. I'm just trying to keep getting better because yeah, I still feel like there's so many. I look at some of the sculptors out there and feel a bit inspired and inadequate sometimes when you see some of the stuff out there.
I mean, you mentioned the Tombstone rules, but you've done a few rule sets that sort of support your miniatures as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so it started because back in the day, do you remember Warhammer Historical? They used to do
Sure.
so they had a few rule sets, but the two we used to actually sell was Legends of the Old West, the cowboy one, and Legends of the High Seas was the pirate one. Now some of our models are actually in the pirate one in
Right.
the pictures. And we used to sell loads of those, and people used to use our models to. And at some point, I can't remember when they stopped producing it, and so that was a problem. So that's when the idea came. Well, maybe we'll do our own. And so I asked Gav Thorpe did the rules, and so the brief was to do like a core system that could then be adapted for both pirates and cowboys. So the first one became what was Cutlass that we released, and then a few years later, from what we learned from that, we tweaked slightly and became Tombstone. So we did a Tombstone. I mean, it did that in 5 languages.
Right.
It was absolutely correct. I think like basically a one-man band, and we did released the book in 5 languages. Well, we released a hard copy was only in English, but we translated it into 5 as a PDF, and that's when we did the Kickstarter with like 100 new models, and so that was a big thing. But yeah, that's very popular. I don't think we'll do. That was part of my kind of scaling back. Was like, no, I don't think I'll be doing any more
Right.
rules or anything. Just focusing on miniatures now. But yeah.
I mean, I suppose then that's the sort of natural question of what is next then for you and for Black Scorpion. Where do you want it to go in the future?
Yeah, so on a personal level, I've got back into found some time for miniature painting, so I'm kind of getting back into Golden Demon and focused on that. And Black Scorpion's still doing the same. I'm just trying to keep sculpting models and keeping things under control. The main thing that's probably going to happen is, in addition to what I'm doing now, is digital stuff. I have been learning some digital sculpting. We did some cowboy buildings digitally. I did a Kickstarter for. I will be doing some like organic digital sculpting. I'm not sure where that will go, but some, either on My Mini Factory or maybe a Patreon or something. But that'll definitely be alongside the normal sculpting, because I do feel like hand sculpting is kind of what we're known for. So I'll stick to that. But yeah, it's just one, it's interesting to learn it, but it's just the way things are now with digital is kind of, you've got to be involved in it in some way, or it's.
Does it feel quite different, digital sculpting to the sort of traditional stuff? Is it quite a different process?
Yeah, well, I'm still learning, so I'm certainly not an expert on it, but yeah, it's very different. My actually, don't know if you know Felix Paniagua from, he used to work at Games Workshop. He works at Avatars of War now.
Right. Okay.
He's been helping me just on the internet, just giving me advice and tips. Yeah, for me, it's very different. Actually, when I was at Games Workshop is when they first were bringing in the digital, and they took all the sculptors down to, I guess, the people that sell the software or the hardware, took us all down to demonstrate the computer when they had like a little sculpting extension.
Right.
So I'm not sure if they were selling the actual hardware or they were the. And so we all went down there. I think people realised some more than others, like, oh, things are going to change. This is. They put me with because they didn't have enough computers. They paired us up together. They sat me with Brian Nelson, who's like the best sculptor and universally accepted as the best. He's very, very humble and modest, and I was particularly bad with computers at the time. He's like, "Oh, you have a go first." And, oh God! So I'm playing, like making a blob like a child on this thing. Like very quickly, like, yeah, you have a go. He like knocks up a skull, like a really amazing. I'm like, oh. Yeah. The parries were very. It's funny. The parries were very good with them. They don't use digital, but instantly they did like a really nice little head, and so that was my first kind of play with it. But
Mm.
yeah, it's very different. I don't. It certainly doesn't give me the same feel or joy as hand sculpting, so that's why I'll be sticking to that. But from a business point of view, I will be doing some.
Mm.
We'll see how that goes.
Yeah. And the other thing I just want to ask before we wrap up as well is you mentioned going back into painting, and then I see the golden demon behind you. I mean, what
Oh
was
yeah,
the what was that? What did you win for? And is that something you're going to pursue in the future? Keep on with the
yeah.
golden demon.
That's the one I was saying about before I started. So it was a long time ago. That was a what was it? An ogre standard bearer, like a bronze I got.
Right.
And then obviously when you start the studio, you can only enter the open.
Yeah.
And so me going on about Golden Demon and that, and then Martin started entering. Martin, so I was stupid. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna say he starts winning everything. Um, and I don't know how many opens he won since, but yeah, he's a tremendous painter. So yeah, so that's just because of time now. It's something I've because it's kind of been my earliest ambition was Golden Demon. So it's funny coming back because actually I hadn't painted. I paint the stuff for the website, but that's not really enjoyable because it's very much a time sensitive. It's just got to look good enough for the photography. And so last year at Warhammer Fest, that's the first time I painted properly in about 17 years, actually. So
Right.
that was a kind of a warm up. That's what I did behind me. I don't know if you can see it.
The diorama.
Yeah, there's like the Celestial Observatory I did. There's pictures of it somewhere online.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I've got plans for this year's. It's in Essen, Germany this year.
Right.
I don't think they're doing a UK one, but I'll
Don't
go to
believe
the
so. No.
yeah, I'll go to the Essen one, and I'll be ready. I'm sculpting. I've got 2 entries. I'm sculpting it all this time, so
Yeah.
it's an old world, old school fantasy. So
That sounds fun. That sounds like
probably get
something
carried
I'd
away.
like to
Probably get carried away with the sculpting again and forget you have to pay. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining me and for chatting to
No
me. It's
problem.
been a real joy to hear some of that background to what it was like working at GW and how you've taken that all into your career. So yeah,
No
fantastic
problem. You're
stuff.
very welcome. It's good to speak to you.
Thank you so much, Adam, for taking the time to talk to me about your awesome career in miniatures. It was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you. If you would like to support my work here on the channel, please consider checking out my Patreon. It is the only way that I'm able to keep doing what I'm doing, and I really appreciate it. I'm also very grateful for anybody who can like and subscribe to the channel and share this video, comment on it. That's all really super helpful stuff as well. You can now find my interview conversations as a podcast. Just search in your podcast feed for In Conversation with Jordan Sorcery, and you should be able to find it. Thank you once again to Adam. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.